The meeting between Putin and Trump in Alaska stirred up the Z patriots and vatniks, a battered sense of greatness. Propagandists and just kitchen table devotees of historical justice with the clinking of faceted glasses started shouting that Alaska is ours, and that these Americans need to be reminded that it is still part of the Russian Empire. Return Alaska. Return what is ours. Ours. Our own. We will take what is ours wherever we see it. The news that Putin and Trump are meeting specifically in Alaska stirred up the patriotic public. Swamp conspiracy theorists are even seriously discussing that Alaska was not actually sold to the states, but leased to them, and that this lease will soon expire. There are some myths surrounding the sale of Alaska, right? One of them is that we didn't sell it, but only leased it out. What is this myth and where did it come from? Indeed, this whole... Let's put it this way. All these events are shrouded in a certain mystery, you could even say to this day, with the unusual procedure for signing the agreement and some legal violations. And of course, this gave rise to a lot of rumors. And then, when they looked at the actual document, they saw that the word used isn't even in English. It's not sale, but cession, which is some kind of concession. Russians enthusiastically shouted that Putin was meeting with Trump, practically on their own land. After all, Alaska is historically Russia, even more so than Crimea. Propagandists without hesitation call the American state Russian Alaska. Russian Alaska greets air travelers even while they're still in the air. Every plane landing at Anchorage Airport flies over Cape Vorontsov, named after a Russian ambassador in London. Ninilchik, Kasilov, Nikiski, and others directly reference Alaska's Russian heritage. And many residents of the state, descendants of Russian settlers, practice orthodoxy. Pathetic and miserable attempts to justify one of the most shameful and foolish decisions in the history of the failed empire and all of human civilization. No matter how much the Laput wearers drool over Alaska now, there is an undeniable fact. Russia gave it to the Americans without a fight for a handful of bagels. They have no brains? Tsarist Russia sold a vast region for $7 million. $7,200,000. A huge sum for those times. In fact, taking inflation into account, today that's $157 million. Cheaper than footballer Mbappe. And that's for a territory half the size of the European Union, with access to the ocean and enormous reserves of gold, oil, and gas. Some of the scrap-carrying crowd will grunt, well, back then the Tsar didn't know that oil and gas would make money. But humanity has known the value of gold for a long time. My precious. After the purchase, the famous gold rush began in Alaska. The gold mines yielded millions of ounces of precious metal. In other words, the Americans recouped the cost of buying Alaska in just a few seconds. Modern mining produces 1 million ounces of gold annually, worth $2.5 billion. To come here and earn a lot of gold as much as we want, quickly and in large amounts. That doesn't work out. It's hard work, tough work, but there is gold. Besides gold, Alaska also has some of the world's largest deposits of silver, copper, and zinc. And these metals were also very valuable. In the mid-19th century, saw sure a saw. And when oil and gas started being developed in Alaska, the purchase deal became downright indecent. The northern state is one of the largest hydrocarbon producers in the United States. Reserves are estimated at 3.2 billion barrels of oil and over 35 trillion cubic feet of gas. That's hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. It's hard to even estimate Alaska's total resources, but we're talking trillions of dollars. This is the famous Trans-Alaska Pipeline. The length of this pipe is 1,287 kilometers. It runs through mountains, crosses the permafrost zone, the migration routes of caribou, transporting oil from Alaska's northern coast at Prudhoe Bay to the south of the state to the port of Valdez. The pipeline, which was launched on June 20th, 1977, is considered one of the most secure in the world. So how did it happen that such a so-called, in quotes of course, great empire gave away the northern El Dorado for next to nothing? Well, it's very simple. Tsarist Russia literally begged America to buy Alaska, because at that time the empire was in the grip of a terrible economic crisis. In the 1860s, Russia's financial system was falling apart. A huge national debt, a massive budget deficit, backward industry, and low labor productivity. That's why the Tsar was looking for any money at all, just to stay afloat. In reality, Russia sold Alaska for next to nothing, like a drunk pawning his TV for a bottle. The only difference is that the drunk doesn't run around later shouting that the TV used to be his. Yesterday in Yekaterinburg, a drunk, completely wasted, stole someone else's TV in broad daylight right out in the open, and just as publicly, later threw it in the trash, which is why he's now going to jail. Russia sold Alaska after its defeat in the Crimean War, which ended in disgrace in 1856. And for many Vatniks, this is also an excuse for the insane deal. They say the country, after a tough conflict with the entire West, was economically weakened and needed money. But the funny thing is, the US was also in turmoil after a devastating civil war, which ended literally right before the purchase of Alaska. In other words, Russia sold Alaska for next to nothing 11 years after its own war. And the US bought Alaska just 2 years after its own war. Why eggplant? 20. Maybe after all for 20? Moreover, in Russia, the war took place on a small piece of land in Crimea. Whereas in the US, the fighting happened across almost the entire territory. But in the end, America quickly recovered from the shock, and the economy began to grow. Industrialization and the settlement of the West began, and the country saw an influx of investment and labor. And in Russia, the devastation was so great that they sold almost 2 million of the richest square kilometers of territory for a bowl of cabbage soup. This is a verdict on the entire Russian world and the so-called binding civilization. With nothing to their name, with a poor dying population, bursting heating systems, rotting pipes, a collapsed housing and utility sector, insane prices for potatoes, bread, butter, and lines for chicken eggs. But at least we're fighting for the interests of the global South with an anti-colonial agenda against the decaying West, where officials have villas, yachts, and billion-dollar accounts. But seriously, things are actually much worse. For the first time in 3.5 years of war, Putin suddenly let slip that, as it turns out, there is a war. And sanctions are not only not benefiting us, but are also destroying the Russian economy and budget. Many imperialists are, of course, outraged right now, saying that such a valuable territory should never have been sold. But at that moment, Russia didn't really have much of a choice. It was so weak and backward that it could have lost it for nothing at all. The Tsar was afraid that the British, who had already dragged his face across the Crimean table, would simply come and take Alaska by force. There were neither resources nor military capability. Petersburg had nothing to oppose them with. That's why the Bast-Schude ruler hurried to at least squeeze a few kopecks out of his American neighbors. The sale of Alaska is not just an example of a bad business deal. It reflects the entire miserable state of Russia. And the people of Alaska were actually very lucky to have been sold, because now they live in the richest country in the world. They are not in a decaying, dying cesspool where human life is worth less than a pair of foot wraps. Everyone understands where we are heading. You don't need a degree in history. It's enough to have average intelligence to grasp the retrospective of future events. All these conspiracy theories about Putin and Trump meeting in Alaska are nonsense, some kind of historical parallels for the gullible. The meeting took place in Anchorage because the balding dictator was afraid to fly too far from his own border. Plus, in any other American city, he would have been met with massive public protests. Although here they were mistaken. In Alaska, the dictator was warmly welcomed only by Trump. Thousands of people took to the streets of Alaska to remind Putin who he is and where his place is. Sir. Alaska is symbolic because today Russia is waging a disastrous war in Europe. Its economy is falling apart, the budget has a huge deficit, and the population is becoming impoverished. Everything is heading toward Moscow, soon having to sell off its lands for cheap again. And this process can no longer be stopped. Millions of hectares in Siberia and the Far East are being handed over to China for decades. History is cyclical, and so is historical justice.
I would like to remind you that this video is created for entertainment purposes and contains elements of satire and irony. All facts and events are presented in a hyperbolized or exaggerated form to convey a comedic or dramatic effect. Our goal is not to mislead, but to highlight humor. Please take it with a smile.